Specific temptations. After we have confessed a particular sin and received forgiveness, we must be prepared to be tempted in that area of vulnerability. Here's Gene.
This principle is illustrated in the lives of the Jewish exiles when they actually returned from Babylonian captivity. And this is what this text is all about here in Ezra chapter 4, verses 1 to 5. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple for Yahweh, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the leaders of the families and said to them, "Let us build with you." Now, the important thing to realize is that right from the very beginning, they're called the enemies. But they don't come as enemies. They actually said, continuing, "For we also worship your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time King Esar-Haddon of Assyria brought us here." And let me simply say that these were the people primarily that in the New Testament were called the Samaritans. And they were taken into captivity, but they were also brought back by the king of Assyria. And as they came back into this area, although many of them claimed to worship the God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, yet they incorporated into their worship all kinds of paganism. And this is called syncretism. And let me simply say that that was one of the reasons why God took them into Assyrian captivity, the northern kingdom, and why ultimately the southern kingdom was also taken into captivity, into Babylonian captivity, because they had gone after false gods and they had incorporated the worship of false gods into the worship of the one true God. And so basically, these Samaritans are coming, these people who lived in the land, and say, "Hey, let us build the temple with you because we really worship the same God." Well, yes, they did, but they also worshiped false gods. So here, immediately what we see is the temptation to engage and work with people who are involved in pagan worship and have them be a part of building this temple to the Lord after they came back from this Babylonian captivity. So we read here, "But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the other leaders of Israel's family answered them." They passed the test, and we see that. "You may have no part with us in building a house for our God." Why? They discerned that they were engaged in paganism. They discerned that they were really enemies of Israel. They discerned that they were trying to manipulate the situation as they came and offered to help build the temple. "You may have no part with us in building a house for our God, since we alone must build it for Yahweh, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." And then the people who were already in the land discouraged the people of Judah. What happened when they rejected their offer? It revealed their hearts. Because what we read here is these people began to discourage everybody. And they began to make them afraid to build. They also bribed officials to act against them, to frustrate their plans throughout the reign of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of King Darius of Persia. In other words, basically, once their offer was rejected, once the children of Israel saw through this, and the leaders of Israel saw through this, then they began to treat them exactly the way they wanted to treat them in the beginning. They were really the enemies of Israel, as we read from the biblical text. And so here we have an illustration of being tempted in their area of vulnerability, tempted in the very area of why they were taken into captivity in the first place, because they left the worship of the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and syncretized into their worship false gods and the worship of false gods. In the New Testament, Paul dealt with this. For example, the Corinthians. The Corinthians were converted out of incredible paganism and immorality. And what we have here is actually a lesson from the Old Testament, from situations like we've just read about. Paul referred to these, and this is what he said. Now, these things happened to them, referring back now to these Old Testament situations. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written as a warning to us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So, here's the warning. Here's a tremendous warning to all of us. So whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. Because we can be tempted in the very areas of vulnerability. Satan specializes in that. And so we have to be very, very careful. We may think we have victory over this, but suddenly we're blindsided. And so Paul warns against that. Whoever thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. But here's the good news. Against the backdrop of somewhat the bad news in terms of temptation and vulnerability. Paul goes on to say, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to humanity. You see, even back there in this Old Testament setting, that was a temptation that they were facing that was common to humanity, but also in a specific way to their fellow Jews as to why they went into captivity in the first place. But God goes on through Paul to say, here's the good news. God is faithful, and He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation, He will also provide a way of escape so that you're able to bear it. And that's the good news that God gives us in relationship to specific temptations. Let me read that principle again so you see the relationship. After we've confessed a particular sin and received forgiveness, we must be prepared to be tempted in that area of vulnerability. Satan will see to it. He knows that is our area of weakness, and we've got to be very careful. So here's the reflection and response question. What are the specific areas where some Christians today are particularly vulnerable to satanic attacks? Particularly as it relates to their lifestyle before they became believers. Or perhaps to their lifestyle in terms of the way they have gone backwards in their Christian life. I listed a few of these. Some Christians are very vulnerable in the area of materialism. Material things was their life. Then they became a Christian. Do you think they're ever going to be tempted in the area of materialism? Obviously, yes. Satan knows that's an area of weakness. What about manipulation? Before a person has become a Christian, they're manipulators. They control people. Are they ever going to be tempted after they become believers in the area of being manipulative? Satan will see to it. He knows that's an area of weakness. What about sexual immorality? He specializes in that one, in tempting people in their area of weakness. Pornography is an incredible plague today. And when a person becomes a Christian, will they ever be tempted in that area? Obviously. Satan will see to that. What about dishonesty? What if a person is dishonest in business? That becomes a part of his life, a part of his thinking, which, by the way, is a part of our culture. We see this illustrated almost every day in our culture, from the highest levels of government into the arena of finances and economics. Again and again, we see this dishonesty. We see it even in the school systems, where teachers become vulnerable to being dishonest, to make themselves look good. And we've seen some of that. It's a terrible situation. And some people justify it and say, you can't survive apart from white lies. I remember one time, just as a young man, I was involved in some business, trying to put bread on my table in sales, and I began to see that in the presentation there was a lie. And the guy who was training me says, yeah, that's a little white lie, but if you don't lie, you won't sell. And I said, I can't sell. Now, there are people that are used to telling, quote, white lies, which are lies. Then they become believers. Do you think they're ever going to be tempted to lie in business? You better believe it. That's where Satan is going to hit them. What about in the area of taxes? Let's say I'm a businessman and I know how to cheat on my taxes. Doesn't take much brain power to figure out how to cheat on your taxes. There are all kinds of ways. I'm not talking about legitimate loopholes. I'm talking about dishonesty. I'm talking about cash transactions that are not going to be, you're not going to have even a paper trail. There are some people that operate with cash and never report income. Some of them get caught, some people don't. Let's say I happen to be that kind of person. I've learned how to manipulate the system. And then I become a Christian. Let's say I even become a pastor. And of course, I have a legitimate salary, and this is reported to the IRS. But what about the fact that I'm called upon to do weddings? And with that wedding, it's customary to give the pastor an honorarium for performing that responsibility. Or a funeral, which is customary to pay the pastor and give him a gift for being able to do that. I can't tell you how many times I've been paid in cash. Do you think that if I happen to be a businessman who had a pagan way of dealing with that, do you think I would be tempted not to report that cash as income and pay taxes on it? Nobody's ever going to trace it. But God says I need to be honest, and the government says I owe taxes on that income for services rendered. You see, it's very easy to regress to behaviors that are pagan, that are dishonest, that are inappropriate. And so we're vulnerable in these areas. And that's why this principle reads, after we have confessed a particular sin and received forgiveness, whether it's dishonesty, immorality, whatever it might be, we must be prepared to be tempted in that area of vulnerability, because it's sometimes so easy to regress to those things and to live a double life. And so God is saying to us, be consistent. Live Jesus Christ in every aspect of our life. That's the power of that principle.